Welcome to the Menard Family Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm really excited today that we're joined by Mark Mills. Mark Mills is at Northwestern University. He's also at the Manhattan Institute. He's a technologist, a physicist, and engineer. He's going to give us a bright future, tell us about why he's very optimistic for the future. So Mark Mills is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a faculty fellow at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science. He is also a strategic partner with Monroe Lane, an energy venture tech fund. Previously, Mills co-founded Digital Power Capital, a boutique venture fund, and was chairman and CTO of ICX Technologies, helping take it public in 2007. Mills is author of the book, The Cloud Revolution, How the Convergence of New Technologies Will Unleash the Next Economic Boom and a Roaring 2020s. And he's host of a new podcast, The Last Optimist. He is also author of a book that came out in 2020 called Digital Cathedrals, and a book in 2018 called Work in the Age of Robots. He earlier co-authored a book with Peter Huber called The Bottomless Well, The Twilight of Fuel, The Virtue of Waste, and Why We Will Never Run Out of Energy. His articles have been published widely, including in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, USA Today, and Real Clear. Mills has appeared as a guest on CNN, Fox, NBC, PBS, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. In 2016, Mills was named Energy Writer of the Year by the American Energy Society. Earlier, Mills was a technology advisor for Bank of America Securities and co-author of the Huber-Mills Digital Power Report, a tech investment newsletter. He has testified before Congress numerous times and briefed state public service commissions and legislators. Mills served in the White House Science Office under President Reagan and subsequently provided science and technology policy counsel to a wide variety of private sector firms, the Department of Energy, and US research laboratories. And prior to that, he began his career as an experimental physicist and development engineer in microprocessors and fiber optics. Early in his career, he was an experimental physicist and development engineer at Bell Northern Research, Canada's Bell Labs, and at the RCA David Sarnoff Research Center on microprocessors, fiber optics, missile guidance, earning several patents for his work. He holds a degree in physics from Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. So as you can tell, he has a very long resume, very knowledgeable. We're going to learn a lot. I'm super excited about it. And by the way, thanks for showing up. It's great to see so many people here today. I'm really excited about this. And thanks to all of our donors, including the Menard family, for making this happen. So could everyone please welcome Mark Mills.
Thanks, John. And the long resume, I apologize. It probably means that I wasn't able to hold a job very long at any particular time. But I'm not that old, obviously. I mean, except having worked for Reagan. And I just want you to know that I was very young then, still in diapers. So for those of you who know how long ago that was, you could just calibrate it that way. I'm going to talk about, obviously by the virtue of the title, what amounts to a fairly optimistic view of the future. Let's get the slides going here. You want to see why this is, I don't know if this is connected. Oh, there we go. And in talking optimistically about technology, it may seem a little discordant given what's in the news politically in the world. I mean, I'm not unaware of politics. I live in Washington, D.C. It's always a crazy place. Politics is a tough business. If you read your history, it's been ugly for a long time. You know that line that is supposed to have been said by Churchill, Margaret Thatcher talked about how lousy a system democracy is, except everything else is worse. So I live that. I did policy work. I do testify. I'm certainly aware that we live at a time of high inflation. This top graph here, if you've followed it, you can see this is mapping out 40 years of inflation. The only time the United States has experienced inflation as high as we're now experiencing was during the very unpleasant stagflation years, stagnant growth and high inflation, when Carter was president. So we're back to a 40-year high for inflation. That's not fun. It's actually very destructive to economies. We worry about competing with China. China's not exactly an irrelevant economic force, a rising military force. This is a graph of China's spending on its military, rising from just a decade ago, below $120 billion. Now it's north of $300 billion a year. Their spending is rising rapidly. You don't have to be anti-Chinese to say that that's significant. I've traveled to China a few times, been to a dozen cities there. I enjoyed it enormously. The Chinese people I met were interesting, fun, innovative in ways that, some ways that we're not. It's a different culture. Chinese government, I'm not a fan of, and they're the ones spending the money on military. And of course, we're in a socially fraught time, whether you are a fan of woke rise or the happiness with America or not. It's obviously having impact on our culture. This is a Gallup poll. You see the bottom right, where Gallup has been asking the same question. Actually been asking this question for more than 20 years. I've been asking this question for almost 40 years. I'm just showing the 20-year timeline, asking people generally if they're proud to be an American. Extremely proud or extremely proud and kind of proud. And the top line is the combined extremely and very proud. You can see it's trending down. People are not super happy about being American. The good news, I suppose, is that 2/3 are still very proud to be American, but that's a long way down from 90%. So why would I be optimistic about the future? As I'll talk about in a bit towards the end, there's always problems in the world. I mean, human beings have this capacity to be creative and innovative and kind. We know this because stories about that go back to ancient Greece, and we also have the capacity to do pretty terrible things, engage in wars. Governments Sovietize economies. We know that because the Soviet Union existed for almost 80 years and destroy lives and destroy economies. So human beings have this yin and yang, to use an ancient term. It's the nature of human nature. But it's also the nature of human nature to invent. Technology is not external to humans. It's sort of treated frequently as somehow there's human nature and then there's technology. To be human is to invent. Humans have always created things, invented things, and we invent things to make our lives better, primarily. Obviously, we use technology to do things that are not nice, but on average, over all of history, what you see is a very long record of humans from prehistory taking things that exist in nature and making things, making products and tools and services that protect us from predations of nature, that protect us from natural events, protect us from other people often, to make living easier, make living more comfortable, to make it more enjoyable. So if you mapped out the things that have changed most about humanity, it's not politics. We've been fighting forever for the same reasons. We've been loving forever for the same reasons. Humans have the same emotional capacities and appetites, if you like, for all of known and written history. You could say that if you look at how Neanderthals lived, that's a picture from a museum of the ostensible Neanderthal life, and how we live, and ask the question, what's the difference between how they got to live and how we got to live? So thinking about a long span of history, you could ask the same question going back 100 years or 200 years, but let's choose 10,000 years. Because at the time the Neanderthals lived, all the same atoms existed that exist today. All the same materials existed. All the same forces in nature existed. All the same sources of energy existed. There's nothing, we did not invent the wind or the sun or coal or oil. We didn't invent molybdenum, copper, nickel. We didn't invent molecules. They've existed in nature for all of time that's relevant. The only difference between how they live and how we live is information, is knowledge. And that we know something about those things, and we do something with those materials different than they could do through the application of two things: information or knowledge and energy. You use energy to change and rearrange atoms, make products and services, And all products and services that make life better, different, have to meet one of the three characteristics. They have to be a useful product or service. You could draw the Venn diagram, and when you make an invention that's a product or service, it has to be affordable, reliable, and useful. I mean, engineers can invent a lot of things that aren't useful. That's called a hobby, not a product or a service. But if you think about the transformation of human nature at a macro level, that describes everything. And the purpose of all of it is to not just survive. You know, surviving's nice, it's useful. You know, I write in my book that nature's been trying to kill humans for all of history. Nature is really hostile. Natural disasters, bacteria, viruses, nature is predatory when it comes to human beings. It just is. So we spent all of history trying to figure out ways to survive nature, the cycles of nature, the predations of nature. But we want to improve our daily safety, not just the survival. We want things to be faster. By that I mean travel to be faster, manufacturing things faster. Speed matters because the most precious commodity in the universe is the number of hours you get to live. That's the only thing that's not replaceable. Human beings have not lived more than 1 million hours for all of known history. There's only been 100 people, roughly, with documented capacity having lived more than 1 million hours. 1 million hours is 114 years and about a couple of months. And of the 100 people have been documented to live longer than that, they've only beat it by months. That is hundreds of hours. And most of those documentations are suspect, but a few have made it in modern times. We want more convenience. We want more comfort. We want beauty in life. We want entertainments. So if you think about the march of history, the biggest change in history has been that we don't have to spend most of an economy, most of our time surviving. That we've not only create and do more things, but we have wealth devoted to things like cleaning up our physical environment, having life be safer, getting to live longer, healthier, having money for entertainment, for travel, for education. All these things come from technology. They don't come from other exogenous forces. They do come from better organizations of governance, for sure. You have to allow people to innovate. You have to allow businesses to create, to operate or fail. That matters. The idea of governance matters. And in fact, I begin my book by pointing out that, you know, if we don't get the politics right, we can Sovietize an economy. This is important. In fact, you'd have to say if you don't get the politics right, nothing else matters, because it doesn't matter how good technology is if governments crush its people. But do the thought experiment. Let's just imagine that since the time of the founding of the United States, which was one of the most remarkable, not perfect, but most remarkable framing of self-organizing a government in a very, very long time in human history, really quite remarkable. And assume that we've had really, for that couple hundred years, we didn't fight as much politically, and we all got along, and that the laws all worked just fine. What would have happened over those 200 years? Would everybody be a lot wealthier, healthier, more comfortable in America if that's all that had changed? We had the framework for that. The only thing that changed that generated an astonishing expansion in per capita wealth in America and the world was technology. If you'd held technology constant for 200 years, but had perfect governance, we'd all be gentlemen or gentlewomen farmers living in a rural agrarian society. Some of you might prefer that, but the world couldn't support a population that exists today. If you don't have to be a historian to go to the magic Dr. Google and look at how most people lived through most of history. So it's the longest preamble. It's important because the reason I wrote my book is because I spent a lot of time with technologists and innovators. And when you look at what's going on in the world, when you look at what's actually happening, you could be, and this is a realistic look, not a aspirational look. What are people building? What are they inventing and turning into a product? Not what they're aspirationally hoping they might do one day. We'd all like to, maybe not, you wouldn't want, maybe everybody would like to be able to go to the moon and live on the moon, or live on Mars like Elon Musk wants to do. These are, kind of science fiction ideas. They're interesting for fiction, that's not very interesting for making forecasts. You want to make a forecast, you want to look at practical things that people have built, innovators, inventors, and whether they are starting to scale. My entire book is focused on the recently created that's already commercially viable, that's not at scale, or put in simplistic terms. It's like looking at the world right around 1920. There were maybe 6 or 7 million cars in the world at the time, not billion. It was obvious there were going to be a lot more cars in the world. It was obvious that would have an impact on the future if you were making any forecasts at the early 20th century. Technology, if you want to put this in economist terms as opposed to product terms, technology is what creates productivity. Productivity, you know what it means. I mean, this is the economics 101 definition is not complicated. Productivity is fewer inputs. There's only 3 inputs: labor, materials, and energy. Fewer inputs to produce more, better outputs. If you do that, you create wealth. The only other way to create wealth through all of history was to steal other people's wealth. You stole their time, you stole their stuff, you stole their land, in other words, you dominated them, and you had more wealth. They didn't. They took yours, right? That's what most of history has been about. Wealth creation through productivity is the opposite of theft. It's the hard to imagine idea that the pie gets bigger, so there's more for everybody. The adage, the rising tide lifts all boats, sounds trivial, except it's in fact true. It's what productivity does. The problem with productivity is it doesn't follow a straight line. So if you measure productivity growth, the rate at which we improve our capacity to get more outputs with fewer inputs is just a growth rate. This is the red line, productivity growth rate. This is in America since the post-war World War II period, 1955. Today, the dotted line is the short-term cycles. The red line is the average productivity growth rate. So what you see is something that's obvious. It doesn't always go up. Sometimes it goes down. It's not a cycle. These are waves. Cycles imply a known fixed period. There's not a known fixed period. In fact, economists are terrible at predicting the direction of productivity changes. Samuelson's an economist who's honest, has pointed out that economists have miserably failed. In fact, if I did this graph, and you could overlay a graph like this with economists' predictions at each period, the consensus prediction at the top economists of the world or in the United States, if you mapped it out, what you would find, what's interesting when you map out the predictions versus what actually happened, is not that they get it wrong, is that it doesn't correlate. If they on average guessed it in the wrong direction, then you know it's a counter bet. The economist says the economy is going to slow down, then you know it's going to speed up, and vice versa, which would be convenient. The problem is there's no correlation. They just aren't very good at it, and it's because it's very hard to predict in the specifics. What it is possible, what I'm predicting, is that when it's low, it almost always goes back up. And there's a reason for that. It's not because it's a cycle. It's because when economies and societies invent new technologies, they have a significant impact as they're adopted. We figure out how to use them. When the trains first came along, no one organized our industrial infrastructure around rail. The first rail trains, as you probably know, looked like the stagecoaches on steel wheels. The first cars looked like horses and buggies without a horse. It takes a while for adaptation to occur. Then you get this splurge of growth. All new technologies reach a point of some saturation until other new things are invented. But the saturation, you get a slowing of growth rates. You just don't know when the new stuff's coming along, except by applying one principle, which is a principle of forecasting, which I stole from Peter Drucker, forecasting what's already happened. So that's, when he was asked in the 1980s, how does he forecast? He was a very famous and smart management consultant. That's what he said. I only forecast what already happened. And people thought he was making a joke. He wasn't. He was saying, you look at things that have already occurred or things that have high inertia. Demographic shifts have high inertia. We know that the United States will have more older people in the future than in the past. That has economic consequence. It's forecastable and useful. We also know in the technology spaces, if somebody invents a product that is actually useful, is commercially viable, it can actually manufacture. It's not a lab bench thing. And it creates a function that has high utility. People will want it. That might get more of them in the future. Again, the invention of the car, not in the 1890 period. There were cars around for 30 years hundreds of thousands, millions of them before we got to the mass production, the assembly line, in the great explosion, if you like, of car use in the 1920s. It took a while to figure out how to make them inexpensively and reliably, but it was obvious to everybody at the time there would be more cars. People would want to use them because they were a lot better than a horse and buggy. If you look around the landscape of technologies broadly today, you find lots of things that are similar to the invention of the car. I'll give you, and that are productivity engines. And again, remember, productivity is fewer inputs with the same or better outputs. One of the inputs is labor. So a good example of a productivity creating machine is the obvious. It's the robot, right? I mean, that's what a robot is. The robot, the automaton, is supposed to replace the human function. No one would buy or use it if it didn't do at least as good a job as the human at lower cost. Because if you're a business owner, you're not stupid. Well, you could be, but you're not, typically they're not, because they don't survive if they're stupid. They buy the robot because it does a better job, faster, more reliably, less expensive than a human. This is the idea, by the way, that technology is at the core. I just put up a quote from Robert Solow, who got the Nobel Prize in '87 in economics for codifying, not just saying. He created a model and looked at the mathematics of the role of various factors in driving economic growth. And he reached the conclusion that the primary driver is technology, because again, technology is how we get productivity. Productivity is how you get wealth. But I pick as sort of the iconic example, I'll come back to it a little bit, the robot, because it's self-evidently a way to increase productivity. This is a picture on your left, 1961, Tonight Show, Johnny Carson. Some of you of a certain age will have watched Johnny Carson. Others of you who are younger, perhaps, can find YouTube videos of Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show. He invited the inventor of the illuminate robot onto his TV show in 1961. That's illuminate. It was a one-armed, bolted to the floor welding robot that year General Motors had installed in its New Jersey factory. That factory went on to become the most productive automotive factory in the world. And you will be unsurprised to know that all of the other automakers started buying robots like that specific one and robots like it. And the primary vector for robot sales ever since then, until just a year or two ago, the majority of robots sold in the world have gone into the automotive sector. It's one of the easiest places to automate because it's a production line, fixed. You can bolt robots to the floor, and because it's a line in the production line. And robots don't need to walk. They can't walk. It's an easier place to automate. It had a profound impact on automotive production. There's no small irony that exactly 60 years after the illuminate was commercialized, but a year later, before it showed up on the Tonight Show again, it actually showed. So Spot Mini, I'm curious, how many people here have seen YouTube videos of either Boston Dynamics Spot Mini or Boston Dynamics Atlas robot? And I'm looking at mostly it's younger people. So for those of you who are older, use YouTube, type in Boston Dynamics Spot Mini. You'll see real robots that are not notional. They're real machines. Spot Mini is ambulatory or anthropomorphic. It looks like a dog. It walks. It's not a toy. It's not a demonstration. It is a commercial product that is being sold / leased or hired into business and industrial environments, primarily for inspection now, to free up humans to do higher value tasks other than walking around with, infrared detector, look for leaks, or walking around looking for safety issues. Safety matters in industrial sites, but you can't put a bolted to the floor robot in an industrial site to have it really useful to do, say, a safety inspection. So the humans train the robot where to walk, literally by driving it, by looking through its camera, and then it does the job itself in that site for that point forward. It's a pretty big deal. As a calibration point, that robot, roughly $100,000, and it can be fully autonomous. The very first American automobile, which looked pretty clunky, but then it was considered amazing, called Durea wagon. It looked like a horse and buggy without a horse, was $100,000 in today's dollars, just as an interesting calibration point. I think the velocity to making this cheaper be a little higher than the velocity to making Durea wagons cheap, because we've already got the mass production line and a few other advances. So we're going to see a lot more of these. Let me switch to a different way of looking at why you might be cautiously optimistic about the prospects for a more economically vibrant future by doing something different than looking at the machine, but looking at, as economists do, at inputs. You know, you measure the health of an economy by inputs too. The more food and fuel consumed, the bigger the economy, the wealthier people are. So it's one measure. If you want to measure how much stuff economies are building, you can look at the three big inputs to what we use to build things: steel, polymers, and semiconductors. These are the three biggest sort of inputs to fabricating stuff, from machines to buildings and the like. What's interesting about this logarithmic graph, you're all smart, you know what a log graph is. It's going up tenfold each time. So what you see here is that back when the president I worked for was president, who was a free market president, who was very worried about the steel industry in the United States and actually proposed a protectionist policy. So I remind my free market friends that even free marketeers can be bent by political reality. He wanted to protect the US steel industry for the predations of imports of steel. About a third of our steel was being imported at unprecedented levels of dependency in 1984. The steel industry in America in 1984, the world rather, this is global purchases. You can see globally, a few $100 billion worth of steel, big industry. Look at the semiconductor industry around 1984, wasn't even at $10 billion. So you would protect steel, not semiconductors. As you all know, in our recent months, we're more interested in protecting semiconductors than steel. It turns out they're almost all co-equal now in terms of inputs. They're all pushing towards $1 trillion of purchases of inputs a year into the global economy. The interesting thing about this is not that we purchase more steel now than we did before, more polymers. Of course, polymers and plastics are used to make everything. Every product, all kinds of clothing, medical products. I mean, you all know this. We've lost our capacity for amazement about polymers because we take them for granted, and now we don't like them because they can be hard to recycle. All that stuff's important, except from an input perspective, they are extraordinarily high utility. You can only make steel a certain number of ways. There are varieties of steel, but you can make an astonishing variety of polymers. You can make an even more astonishing variety of semiconductors. So the dollar value doesn't actually indicate the economic value. The dollar value tells you the input is growing, and it's very big, but the economic value of each of these things is profoundly different. And the most important difference that tells you a lot about the future and the state of the economy in the future, when these things are all at this scale, is the marginal dollar's economic value. By that I mean, if you buy the next dollar's worth of steel, it's going to be a little better than the last dollar's worth of steel, but not a lot different. I mean, steel gets better. We're making steel higher tensile strength, more flexible. Steel gets thinner. Is it? Yes, but a very small increment. The next dollar you spend on polymers have a somewhat higher growth rate in terms of they have different values. We can make it more recyclable, for example, or thinner. So we're using fewer hydrocarbons to make it, but it's marginal. But you all know, I don't have to tell you, it's obvious that marginal dollar spent in the next semiconductor is not just a little better, it's a lot better. I mean, it's no different than the refresh rate that annoys you about your smartphones. It's because the next dollar, you don't spend $1, but per dollar of your $1,000 smartphone, can you imagine if somebody had predicted everybody would want to buy a $500 to $1,000 thing to carry in their pocket or purse? I mean, no one would have imagined that, except it has extraordinarily high utility function, high economic and social value. That's why you wouldn't buy it otherwise. Nobody's forcing you to buy it. But that reality is predictive. It's by definition predictive because markets are purchasing something because it has value to build other things. Semiconductors are being infused into everything, smart machines, smart thing. It's not just into computers, but the marginal impact is rising at a far higher rate than any other input in the history of the human race. This is astonishing. There's a new class of input materials emerging, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I would call computational materials. Kinds of materials that just have never existed before, much as a silicon chip had never existed before. So we have a new class of materials coming in the further future, but my focus on the book was really more about the next decade or two, hence, the roaring 2020s. To really sort of drive home the marginal value issue and sort of transition to a different metric for why the future is going to look very different and economically more productive than the past. We look at one of the iconic things. The iconic semiconductor is not the controller that controls your window in your car going up and down. That's a computer, it's a microprocessor, or that controls your windshield wiper rate, or that controls your anti-lock brakes, or that makes your fridge smarter. Those are all semiconductors. They're considered low-end semiconductors, but the world makes billions of dollars of them. In fact, we make those semiconductors by the kiloton. So we make so many of them now. But this microchip, this is a photograph of a microchip that's not photoshopped. Those are real, that's a real knife and fork. That's one chip, the size of a small pizza. That's one chip. That chip is made by a company called Cerebras. It's an AI chip. It's a machine learning microchip. That microchip, the reason it was invented and it was designed was to perform the function that is very much relevant to what we can say about economic leverage in the future. It's for machine learning. It's a machine learning chip. The graphics processing units are the go-to chip for machine learning. This is 10,000 times more powerful in terms of speed and image processing than the fastest GPU in the world, 10,000 times more powerful. Now, why would I want to do machine learning? Well, other than the dystopian science fiction reasons, I would want it in order to give advice on reading X-rays or better mapping programs or better weather forecasting. That's all in the class of machine learning. Better research, a better Siri voice. Everybody knows that Siri voice, to use the technical term, kind of sucks, right? I mean, you see the Saturday Night Live jokes with Siri voice, or if you haven't seen that YouTube video of I think it's Amazon Echo, it's hilarious because it's not good enough yet. And it's not good enough because the information pattern recognition is lousy, fundamentally. It needs to be 10,000 times better. One chip makes it 10,000 times better. This is not going to be in your phone. It's not going to shrink in size. It has 2 trillion transistors on it compared to a GPU's couple billion or 10 billion. By the way, if you are in the energy business, this one chip uses 3 to 5 times more power than a single home. 15 kilowatts. This is a 15,000 watt chip. There'll be thousands and thousands of these chips made, and they'll show up in data centers in the cloud because the title of the book, which I'll get to, is that the cloud and the information component, the semiconductor component feature of our future is the sort of defining biggest difference about our current time and previous times. Cars have been around a long time. Airplanes have been around a long time. They're getting better. Polymers have been around a long time. The one thing we don't invent very often are new infrastructures. Infrastructures, you know what they are: electricity, rail, canals going back further into highways. We've built an information infrastructure. Inside the information infrastructure, we have things like the Cerebras chip, more and more in the future. I mean, I'll define the difference between the cloud and computing and the cloud and the internet with an example that you all are very familiar with. Because the cloud is as different from the internet as the internet was different from essentially telegraphy, never mind telephony. It's not a computer. It's not doing computing. The cloud is giving advice, democratizes advice anywhere and anytime, increasingly for anything. When you ask the cloud through your phone or your car for how to get from A to B, it's giving you advice. It's not computing a route. It knows something about where you are because you've volunteered your information. You know you have. You've said where you want to go. It's looking at traffic patterns, increasingly predicting traffic patterns based on maps, real time, increasingly evolving weather forecasts. Farmers do the same increasingly for planting. You use what is increasingly called the semantic web, better versions of lousy Siri voice or Amazon Echo, to ask probabilistic questions in normal language about, what kind of grain should I have? All the factors that go into what seeds you would buy are not just weather forecasts, but pricing, future probabilities of grain shortages elsewhere, the kinds of known diseases that might be coming and understood, whole constellation of factors cost of fertilizer, cost of fuel, all those things can be simultaneously, probabilistically analyzed, not computed, and give advice. Not control, but advice. That advice is profoundly different. It's not only in its character, it's not computation, it's advice. It does computation too. That's like saying that you can use your smartphone for phoning too. Okay. Is that what you use it for mostly? I mean, some people only use it for phoning, but even people of a certain generation use it for a lot of things other than just phoning. So the cloud is an infrastructure it's an information infrastructure that uses communications infrastructures, that uses sensors, that uses computers, that uses artificial intelligence. It uses physical things to provide a new character of advice that can be highly specialized and democratized. Democratized means it goes to anybody, anywhere, anytime, increasing any machine, anywhere, anytime. And highly specialized through something that you all have in every one of your devices, an app. An application-specific program is an application-specific tool, which means it's hyper-specialized tool, advice, for a hyper-specialized application, self-evidently. We've been making application-specific tools for all of human history. A wrench is different than a hammer, is different than a screwdriver. And there are lots of kinds of screwdrivers, and there's lots of kinds of hammers, and there's lots of kinds. If you look at the pantheon of physical application-specific tools, there's just shy of 10,000 kinds of tools, maybe a little more than that. If you had to guess, how many application-specific tools do you think the cloud offers you? Not how many get uploaded, but how many specific kinds of apps are there? Millions already. There will be millions more, because the kind of app that a Fitbit has a set of apps in it. And the more things we want to measure, the more specific apps we create, application-specific tools. And they run in an infrastructure. Let's talk about the infrastructure, not in terms of what it does, because obviously it's hard to imagine all the things we might want to do, because it's hard to imagine a limit to all the information we might want to know something about or get advice about. But we know a lot about the physical infrastructure. It's big. At the center of it are data centers. This is a Finnish data center in Finland. Data centers are interesting things. They contain lots of computers. Some are doing computing, some are doing advice, some are doing storage. And yes, the cat videos are all stored in the cloud, and all the YouTube videos, your Netflix stuff, stored in the cloud. So it's a storage function, just like you get when you store your extra furniture. It's just as physical. In fact, they're bigger. Data centers are the size of shopping malls. It's a single building. It's essentially a warehouse scale computer. There are thousands of them. They cost about the same to build as a skyscraper, which is the icon of the growth of the economy of the 20th century. If we look at enterprise class skyscrapers, which is buildings the size of the Empire State Building or bigger, there's about 1,500 in the world. If we look at buildings of the same size in terms of the square feet under one roof, which is north of 1 million, there are already 5,000 data centers of that size in the world. We're building those at a rate 10 times faster than we're building skyscrapers. Skyscrapers not only cost the same to build, but it's interesting, if you are in the real estate business, you'd much rather own the data center because you could rent it for 500% more per square foot, having spent the same dollar to build it. There are real estate investment REITs in data centers because of that. If you're interested in the energy feature, it's worth noting, and maybe it won't be surprising, that if you make a 1 million square foot building full of silicon machines that you put a lot of power into, it might use a little more energy than the skyscraper, like 100 times more per square foot. The global cloud in aggregate, to give you a sense of the scale of this new infrastructure, uses twice as much electricity as the country of Japan. Or in dollar terms, and we're not finished building it, we're at the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end of the era of cloud infrastructure. To give you a sense of why I know that's true, if it was at the beginning of the end, the construction rate would be falling off. It's not, it's growing. We're spending more each year globally in dollars building the hardware and physical infrastructure of the cloud than all the electric utilities in the world spend combined in new utility infrastructure. It's a pretty big infrastructure. Let me switch to a different sort of macro metric that's a little more complicated. It's not that late. You can handle numbers, I think, still, right? This is a university, so I can go rogue and use real data. If you wanted to measure the economic utility of something, It's hard. I mean, it really is, because of the qualitative differences between an app that tells you how much you're walking versus an app that tells you that you might have tachycardia. They're different. And how do you measure the economic value between them? Hard, because there's an economic value to not dying, of course, and feeling healthy. That's very different than just knowing, how far you walk. But you can measure the underlying economic utility function by something like in transportation. Underlying way of comparing all modes of transportation would be to look at the fares to buy a transportation service for you or product and measure that as feet per hour per dollar. How many feet per hour do I get per dollar? Miles per hour per dollar, but I'm going to use feet per hour per dollar. You'll see why in a minute, but feet per hour per dollar, because it's walking, which you could measure in feet per hour per dollar, by paying somebody to carry something. Horse, Pony Express, feet per hour per dollar, same thing. Train, feet per hour per dollar. Stagecoach, feet per hour per dollar. You could measure all across time in real dollars, because we have the numbers. We know economic data going back centuries in feet per hour per dollar of transportation services. And as the feet per hour per dollar get better, people use transportation more. The more feet per hour you get per dollar, unsurprisingly, people care about speed and moving themselves and things. You consume more feet per hour because the cost of them go down. So let's do computations per second per dollar, which is the direct analog for information services. I don't know what you're doing with the information service. I don't know why you're traveling. I don't care. I just know that if I make it more useful by making it cheaper, you'll use more of it, because that's what markets do. So this y-axis is logarithmic. This is computations per second per dollar, tracing the entire era of what we would call modern computing, compute horsepower measured in computations per second per dollar the markets can buy. In the electromechanical age, the adding machine age, if you like, the rate of improvement of that metric was 7 times per decade. So 700% more computations per second per dollar, which is IBM began as, they bought an adding machine company. It's what they were, starting in the 19th century, and they became an electronic computer company. They're now a cloud company. The electronic era of computing, which began after World War II, we bent the curve up. The rate at which that utility function, economic utility function improved, got better at 16-fold per decade. You know, compound interest is like, that's smoking fast. That's really a hot growth rate. So every decade, you got 16 times more computations per second per dollar spent, per real dollar. In the cloud era, that metric is growing at 1,000-fold per decade. You don't have to be an economist to know that has to have consequence. We've only been in the cloud era for about a decade and change. We were in the automotive era for 3 decades before automobiles took off. We're just tipping into the 3rd decade of the dawn of the cloud. The dawn of the cloud, if I had to pick a date, would be like 1998, when Exodus built its first data center as a cloud utility function. So we're just coming into the same time period of figuring out how to build the infrastructure for a high utility function on something that's growing at 1,000-fold per decade of utility function. Let me compare that to the one I started, which was the transportation services, again, measured in feet per hour per dollar. The cloud is improving the economic underlying metric at 1,000-fold per decade, computations per second per dollar. The transportation metric, feet per hour per dollar, also got better 1,000-fold in a century. So the magnitude of the economic utility of technology that brought this profound improvement in feet per hour per dollar took a century, is what's going on in the utility function of information services. It's taken a decade. Again, that's got to be consequential. Markets will do something really interesting with this. A lot of stupid stuff too. I mean, you know, people do stupid things with cars, and we make war machines out of things that are essentially cars too. We weaponize everything. Humans do that. Let's just stipulate humans weaponize everything. We weaponize cleaning fluids to make them in poison gases. That's what people do. We don't have to get theological. People can be bad. Let's just stipulate that. And good people have to be aware and not naive about bad people to build defensive systems. And I address that in the beginning and the end of my book. But I literally book in it for a reason. It's a whole separate book to talk about why we do bad things. It's even a theological book. And books about weapons are really interesting. I was a weapons designer, missile system guidance, and I understand why it's important. I helped design Hellfire, which takes tanks out. I made the guidance detector for the first Hellfires. Important stuff, but it doesn't drive economic growth and make us all better off. It helps protect us. So let me quickly do some specifics instead of macro and just give you extremely high level, but as you might imagine in my book, there's a lot more detail and broader detail across the pantheon of things we're going to do with new machines, new materials, and the velocity of increased economic utility of this cloud function. Back to my robots. I like robots, I'll confess. And I like anthropomorphic robots. I like dystopian robot movies. I think Rise of the Machines is great. Terminator, who doesn't love that? Robots, wonderful. Science fiction has to be dystopian to make it fun. If you write, happy science fiction story, nobody's going to read it. Nobody's going to watch the movie. It has to end badly because that's what we like for stories. But robots have a utility function, and one of the most important ones is to help people. And the most useful way to help people is have the robot function where we are. And where we are, we're anthropomorphic. Tautologically, that's what we. So a really useful robot can walk beside us and do things with us, mobile. So mobile robots are already a $15 billion business. There's about 1 million things that you would recognize as a robot in the world already today. They're not all walking. Most of them are wheeled and rolling and tracked, but they're moving around. And this is a good thing. It's one macro matter because we're short labor. And if I'm an employer, I'd rather upskill the person. Robots are good, but for a very, very long time, most things people will be better at. And you'd rather have people doing things that robots aren't good at. Again, simplistically, the story about the Nobel economist who went to China. This is early days of Chinese expansion, and he drove by a dam site they were building, and they saw excavators and guys with shovels. And he said, "Why in the world you still have people out there digging trenches with shovels?" And he was told by his host, "Well, we have a lot of people we have to employ, so we don't want to go too fast with the excavators." And he is supposed to have said, "Well, give them teaspoons then." I mean, fighting productivity is a priori stupid. We don't have a shortage of jobs, we have a shortage of labor. And we will now even more so in the future, because if you follow demographic trends, you could be despondent at the fact that the working age population is shrinking already in America. It's collapsing in China, and it will start slowing down in the rest of the free world. And as people want more comforts and more things, which require more mining and more activities, it would be nice to have a little help from robots. It's already happening. The biggest vector for mobile robots right now is in the logistics supply chain in warehouses. Right? It's the biggest single market. It's now, logistics supply chain is now surpassing automotive as a vector for robots, but mobile robots. They're mobile there because they have to work alongside people. And what this robot in the bottom left, again, this is from the same people who make Spot Mini that walks. This one's on wheels. It's called Stretch. It's the first robot that is very application specific, which is unsurprising. This application is unloading boxes from trucks. And why would you want to have a robot replace a person unloading a box from a truck? Because the person doing the unloading the box could be trained to drive the truck. Robots are still lousy at driving trucks in most circumstances, especially on the road. Closed mine sites, they're just fine. On the road, they're not so good. They'll kill a lot of people. It will be like the Terminator. It's not good. And it's going to take a long time to get them good enough. This Stretch was the first robot that matched the human, and the human bogey is 800 boxes per hour. Stretch can do 800 boxes per hour reliably, roll itself around, go to another truck, and do it again. And so when Boston Dynamics revealed a available, commercially purchasable product that could do that, they sold out the production run within a day of announcement. DHL bought the whole production run. And there'll be more of these. And this is good. This is not dystopian. Maybe the robots in the future will look like Elon Musk's Optimus. I sure hope so. But most of them are going to look more like Stretch for a while. But the anthropomorphic ones that do walk will, like Spot Mini, have utility function as well. They just have fewer utility functions because it's a general purpose robot. A general purpose robot is less useful for a while than an application specific robot. Other areas where we can expect to see the combination of these new classes of materials, new classes of control systems, new classes of machines themselves that are different in the future than the past. And again, in every case, the metric is I'm predicting something that's already happened. It's no longer theoretical that you can get personal diagnostics. Your Fitbits and your phones are personal diagnostic machines, not just heart rate, blood glucose monitoring is now possible, heart rate monitoring, EKG is now available to you, data you can store for yourself so that when your physician asks you how you felt 2 days ago or 3 days ago, you don't have to guess. You can have the data stored on your smartphone or in the cloud. And increasingly soon in clinical trials are products that I would essentially call computers you can swallow, like a vitamin, that size. In other words, smart sensors embedded in vitamin pills that only live as long as you need them, which is hours, basically the length of time that they have utility in the GI function. These transient electronics are no longer theoretical. By transient meaning they self-disassemble into the basic components they were made from at a pre-programmed time period from hours to days or weeks, and provide information that you might care about, like blood function, other biological functions that you care about because it's your health. Personal diagnostics is already an $80 billion industry on the simple stuff, on track to grow, tenfold quickly. The virtual reality and augmented reality market, I will ask this question, I'll bet it'll be age bifurcated as well. How many people have actually worn virtual reality goggles and tried them out? Let's see how many people of a certain age. A few older people, but mostly younger. They're mostly clunky still. You all know this. I mean, they're like Siri voice. They kind of suck. They're not really good enough yet, but it's obvious they're going to be good enough. Obviously, they're on track to being. Where would you use these things other than gaming, which is kind of fun, and entertainment is fun, but they have very high utility function in training and learning how to do something complicated. You have to use your hands ultimately. That's a harder one, haptics domain, but that's coming too. But seeing something real, that is real, and that you can manipulate in a virtual space, helps you train up. In fact, there are at least 4 companies that do what I would call flight simulators for physicians to practice a surgery that's going to be difficult on you based on a high resolution 3-dimensional imaging of your body and your organs. So the very specific task to avoid very specific locations of blood vessels in you, he can see or she can see and think about manipulating first in practice. We know this causes the accident rates in flying to collapse. They will cause bad outcomes to collapse in healthcare as well. AI and machine learning is a business that has essentially infinite applicability, because what we really are asking the computers to do, they're not computers, is to learn something useful about the complicated environment we're in and see patterns. One obvious pattern is that X-ray film telling you something useful. The physician is often much better than the machine still, but the machine plus the physician is better than either alone, which we're seeing across all kinds of domains. In some domains, the machine can ultimately become better than the human. In others, the human is much, much better than the machine. But by and large, in machine learning and artificial intelligence, the combination is more powerful than either. And then we have what I'm calling computational fabrication, because, when you use your computer and hit print to print a document, you're fabricating ink. You're not fabricating ink, but you're printing, obviously, essentially 2 dimensions. The third dimension is measured in fractions of millimeters, microns of ink powder. You all know a 3D printer can make real products like that from metals and plastics and from an image that you would draw or conceive of. 3D printers have been very hard to make commercially useful. They've been around for several decades. And far too much goofy stuff being said about them initially. Like the Star Trek machine, you hit print and you get your lunch. Is really silly stuff. Not conceptually impossible. It's just no machines can possibly do that right now. But I tell you what, there is a machine in the University of Toronto Hospital that's printing skin for grafts, skin grafts, handheld, by the way, instead of ripping skin off somewhere else in your body or using pig skin. This is consequential. These kinds of things have meaning. And printing metal parts that can be organized and designed in ways that nature grows parts. Growing a part, if you like, is very different than machining a part, because the subtractive process makes it impossible to do certain things. A simplistic example, if you want a hollow thing in the middle of an integral piece of metal, The only way you can do that is make two pieces of metal and put them together and have the hollow thing in the middle, which you can weld and glue and all that stuff. But with 3D printing, you could grow the metal part to have internal complex shapes, the way we humans and plants grow, which really profoundly changes both the character of the thing you're building and its cost efficacy. 3D printing of the rocket engines for SpaceX and Orion are, in fact, a very significant reason that their engines are cheaper and have superior performance over historic engines that were machined. And the last sort of constellation of examples would be the drones are here. We don't have to speculate that drones are useful. They're used for inspection. They're used for all kinds of, not just entertainment. It's a huge industry, already a $10 billion industry. Not talking about using DJI to, take wedding videos. We're talking about insurance companies using them instead of climbing on roofs, right? To do inspections. This is the Wingcopter. It's a German company. They received a few months ago a purchase order for, I think it was 15,000 of these. They're in commercial service for the last several years in Africa. In difficult to deliver places are difficult to deliver, important, relatively lightweight things like medical supplies, anything of high value that might not weigh more than 5 or 10 kilograms. There's a lot of stuff like that in the world, including things that you deliver. I mean, when and admit it, you've all ordered like a toothpaste by Amazon to have a big diesel truck delivered to your house. I mean, this is profoundly inefficient way to get a book or a piece of toothpaste. It's really convenient. What's more economically efficient would be a relatively quiet drone that would do that. Well, where would that have utility? Well, probably not in a highly dense urban core because the truck's just fine there. But as you get ex-urban areas and rural areas, drone delivery becomes significant. And one statistic I'll give you that's kind of interesting that would suggest that the Wingcopter class of drone delivery will come to America sooner than you think is this one fact. You'll be unsurprised by it. During 2020, you all know why, 20% of the American population moved 20% in 1 year out of urban zip codes to rural zip codes. Technically, we're in a urban zip code here. Feels kind of rural for those of us. I mean, I grew up in a farm country, so this is urban to me, but it feels rural compared to New York. That is a big movement. Half of those people, according to a JP Morgan analysis a few months ago, it's probably sticky. Half of them are moving back to the city. They're the people that have to work in the city or kind of like New York for inscrutable reasons, but they like the lifestyle, whatever. I like New York. They like to visit it. I don't want to live there. But if half of the population that move stay in ex-urban and rural counties, one of the reasons they're staying there is not just because they can work from anywhere, it's because they can get the stuff they want from anywhere. And delivering the stuff there by drone is going to be far more efficient given the density than it will with big trucks. It's going to be a big deal. Molecular machines, anybody remember, or watch the Goofy movie, Fantastic Voyage? Isaac Asimov, if you never did, like a few of us. It's good. You like iRobot, Isaac Asimov, Fantastic Voyage is more interesting because what he imagined is now possible. He imagined not shrinking machines to tiny stuff. The movie is like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, except Asimov thought of it 40 years earlier. Honey, I Shrunk the submarine, and the submarine goes around your blood vessel and fixes something, right? Cool idea. If you can make a submarine with a drill bit to swim around your blood vessels and drill a hole in a cell and deposit the medicine directly into the nasty cell and not poison the rest of your body, wouldn't that be nice? So the 2016 Nobel Prize was given to chemists who make machines like that. This is a picture of one that looks like it has 4 balls that are like wheels. That's those are molecules. Those are assembly of molecules. So there's only thousands of molecules, not billions and trillions in that. This is that's a car that drives. It works. And it's a self-assembling automobile. It's pretty tiny. It's smaller than your blood cells. And it can operate inside of your blood system, powered externally either by acoustics or infrared lasers, and could do things like deliver medicines to specific cells, because you wouldn't just put one in your body like in the movie. You'd put millions and millions of these in your body. They're harmless. I mean, they'll wash out of your body when you're done. Why would you do that? Because instead of insulting all of your cells, these cars actually look for the tags that go to the cancer cells, drive on them, mount a drill bit. I'm being dead serious. Looks like a drill, drills a hole in the wall of the cell. Cell has no protection against mechanical drills. There's no biological protection against that, and then shoots the nanoparticle in that has the depth charge that kills the nucleus of the bad cell. Products like that are in clinical trials. So when I say I'm going to predict the future, that this is going to be a revolution in healthcare, which has profound economic implications, I'm not predicting science fiction now. I'm predicting something that's already happened. The last thing I'll give you as an example is what I was sort of computational discovery or computational microscopes. Another Nobel Prize, 2017, went for a microscope called a cryo-EM, cryogenic electron microscope. Big word for it. It's a microscope that can image movies of living operating proteins, which is the holy grail of biological research. You want to actually see what it looks and operates like. Because to see cells, we kill them, slice them up, image them, stain them, and look at them. But seeing what things are at the cellular level actually operate is profoundly insightful for medicine and for science. There are machines that do that, but they are incredibly complex. They generate petabyte classes of data. Or put differently, one of these microscopes generates more data per movie than the entire world generated in the year 1995. I mean, it's astonishing. You can't put it in a thumb drive. If you know your bytes, a petabyte is a semi-trailer full of thumb drives, which would be, put differently, about 10 tons of thumb drives you need for petabytes. This will change discovery. We are moving into an era of not replacing scientists in discovery. These are tools that scientists use, and they're combined with artificial intelligence, and the computational assistance is going on in the cloud because it's the cheapest and fastest way to get access to that computational horsepower. We are on the cusp of as big a revolution in discovery as occurred when we discovered things like microscopes and telescopes in the first place. The step function is that big in terms of our capacities to see things in nature. When we can see things in nature, the old adage, you can't fix it if you can't measure it. Well, you can't fix it if you can't see it. You have to be able to see it and measure it. Profound changes in this. What it will do is finally bend the curve. I'm going to come back to macro and then stop. The ultimate measure on all this stuff, back to productivity, is the change in the real value of something. So economists measure real value output. Do I get more value for the same dollar in? The Federal Reserve tracks this, economists track this. And the blue line tells you that for the last 2 decades, digital industries, this is communications, information, news, entertainment, finance, banking, digital stuff, things that are already information-centric. Their productivity has increased almost to 170%, entirely because they're getting digitalized. You get an easy one, the obvious example is, what does it cost to get a movie to people? To get a movie to people back in the celluloid days when you had to pay in real dollars, $20 to go to the theater, and the movie itself was on a polymer, had to be replicated, duplicated, carried, big cans moved around. All that has economic friction. Streaming has a very low friction, obviously. Still has a lot of hardware behind it, the cloud, but it's very low friction. So it's an economic amplifier just in the entertainment industry. Explosive growth in the entertainment industry and their productivity. And same is true in finance and banking. Your phone is an ATM. I mean, ATM was a big deal. Banking industry thought that was a big deal. The ATM is in your pocket. That's what, and not digital currencies. I don't know, I could ask the question, how many of you tap, right? But if you think about what an ATM is and what tapping with your phone connected to your card or your bank system, you've just amplified the velocity with which you have exchanges go on. That's why you see this curve, this economic utility rising. But you didn't see it in the physical industries after about 2008, and almost nothing in healthcare. The product, if you want more good healthcare outcomes, you spend more dollars and put more people into it. In fact, typically you put more dollars with people, but you get lousier outcomes. In fact, some researchers coined this term when they saw this graph, Eron's law. You know what Moore's law is, right? The Moore's law was the measure of the rate of increase of computers per chip and the collapse in cost of computing. Flip the word more around, you get EROM, and said healthcare does the inverse of Moore's law. The more people and more time, the poorer the outcomes. AI, machine learning, cloud, the constellation of materials will finally break the back of Eroom's law. So this, to end with two Venn diagrams, I want you to, I begin my book with the Venn diagrams, but I'm ending with the Venn diagrams because the Venn diagrams make more sense if you get the zeitgeist of what I'm telling you. We have revolutions going on in three spheres. Society is, everything we do, everything we build comes in one of these three spheres. I began with, remember, information. Information is the infinite resource, the critical resource. How we get it, how we measure, how we move information, how we communicate. We have artificial intelligence, the cloud infrastructure. We have a way to get, when I say infinite data, the explosion in sensors, capabilities to measure everything from where you move to how atoms move. It's a revolution of profound proportions in each of those within the sphere of information. We have a revolution in machines, drones and autonomous robots, Spot Mini, printing organs with 3D printers, printing machines at the molecular scale. These are each of them revolutionary. The machine domain is undergoing its own set of revolutions, simultaneously, synergistically, and the materials field is undergoing revolutions. The smart computer you're going to swallow is made possible by what's called transient electronics, or knowledge of materials, to allow them to be not only biocompatible, but self-disassembling, harmless, and self-destructing, so to speak. We have things you've heard of called smart materials, materials that heal themselves. It's no longer crazy to think of a lot of products that once there's minor damage to them, they heal themselves. Kind of like Terminator, you know, I know. And you're going to worry in science fiction, that's okay. 500 years from now, there'll be Terminators maybe, but mostly it's going to be really dumb stuff like glass healing itself. That's it, not robots. But maybe the surface of the robot, maybe it's a sense. Now this constellation, when they all happen simultaneously, causes what Joel Moyker, who's an economic historian at Northwestern, stole a term from my favorite field, physics, and said, what you get is phase changes in society. And it used that phrase because if you all, with a little luck, remember your high school physics, you know what a phase change is. If you make water hot enough, at some point it's not just hotter water, it becomes a gas, it's not a liquid. Gas is different than a liquid. It's not just hotter water. So his point was that when you make enough change, when you heat an economy up enough with these kinds of technologies, you get a phase change. You don't just get a bigger economy, you get a profoundly different and bigger economy. And what's interesting about what's going on today is exactly what was going on almost exactly 100 years ago for the first time. The beginning of the end of the beginning of the revolutions in each of those same three spheres was happening in the 1920s. Cars had been invented earlier, just like 3D printers have been invented earlier in our time. But the commercialization of cars took off in the 1920s. The commercialization of aircraft took off in the 1920s. Electrification took off in the 1920s. The first electric power station was 30 years before that. The takeoff was in the 1920s. The materials revolution happened in the 1920s. Polymers weren't invented in the 1920s. They were invented in the late 19th century. They took off in the 20s, as did the pharmaceutical industry, as did the superior class of alloys that made it possible to make all the big machines and rail lines that exploded, as did the aluminum industry, which made aviation possible. All that class of things gelled and began to accelerate in the 1920s. And also the 1920s was a period of the efflorescence of information revolutions. Telephony had been invented before that, but it took off then. Radio had been invented, been around 30 years before that. Helmholtz, Hertz, I mean, Faraday. We knew a lot about radio waves for more than 3 decades before radio took off. If you were an investor in RCA in 1922, you would have seen your stock go up 10,000% in 6 years by 1928. Because that was the velocity of the adoption of radio, faster than smartphone, faster than computers. You know, it's different today. It's different today. This is the this is where people who don't read history redound. The velocities were very similar, and importantly, same character things. And the professionalization of science happened then. I'll end with this. Okay, I'm an optimist, and come on, we had Trump, we got Biden, we've got China, we got Ukraine, we got inflation, we've got debates about race, the world's in a hell of a, you're optimistic, you're an idiot. obviously. You're not paying attention to the hellhole the world has become. Again, use Dr. Google and ask Dr. Google to give you a little history in Wikipedia, which is pretty accurate. It's amazingly accurate. Not perfect, but it gives you great vectors, but it's good enough. And any one of these things from 1920, we just come off of World War I, which was horrific, using gas warfare, the first industrialized war and carnage, which scarred people. The 1918 flu took 3 years to abate in 3 waves right into 1920. It was horrific. It killed 400% more people than the evil COVIDs, and it killed the young. Didn't kill the old. The asymmetry was the inverse of what's happened in our pandemic. Imagine if you'd just been through 3 years of waving waves of a pandemic that killed children and teenagers and your friends if you're a student. This is really different. It had to affect. They were like us. We had the Red Scare, the Bolshevik Revolution. There were race riots. Charleston, South Carolina, and other cities were put under martial law for days, in some cases a week at a time. We had labor strikes where they were killing strikers. We had prohibition. We had a constitutional amendment, of all things, to ban the consumption and sale of a substance that humanity had been consuming and producing since before written word, alcohol. And that law stayed on the books for 13 years, just to know how stupid Congress can be. This is I am fully aware that Congress can do equivalently bad things today. It probably will. Eugenics movement was in full. You think we have race problems today? Read about eugenics and what that was about and what that was like. And it wasn't a bunch of fringe crackpots who believed in eugenics and sterilizing the quote stupid. By that they meant the poor. It was every major university and the president of every Ivy League university, Harvard and Yale and Princeton, all genuflected to the science of eugenics. It was horrific. We had yellow journalism. You got fake news today. The original word for that is yellow journalism. In the early 1920s, there were 22,000 newspapers in this country. You know there's not that many today. Many of them published 3 times a day. Do you think there was enough news in 1922 to publish 3 times a day, 22,000 papers? That's a pretty fast news cycle. A lot of you probably don't check the news 3 times a day. Some of you do, a lot of people. 3 times is a pretty high frequency to check news and obsess over and read something newspaper length. So what did they do then? They made it up. You can read epic stories about utterly fabricated, made up BS. Complete fabrication stories about potentates and famous people, and a lot of lawsuits, a lot of angst over the destruction of the news cycle. That was caused by technology, by the way, because the chemical industry developed pulp paper at the time, made printing papers cheap. The printing press became a steam-driven press, so it could go very fast. And all of a sudden, making and printing papers because of technology. Does this sound like the internet? Technology allowed an explosion of the pushing out of news to people, which wasn't news. It was mostly garbage. Income inequality was much greater then than today. The robber barons, the Gold Coast, none of the titans today are in relative or in inflation-adjusted terms close to as wealthy as the titans of that era. In fact, they were so rich that when the U.S. went into default in apologize, I forgot the date. I think it was either 19 or 1920, went into default. The government went into, was on the brink of going into default, which would have been an economic collapse for the United States of America. J.P. Morgan single-handedly loaned the government enough money to keep it solvent for the few days it was needed to get everything fixed. All of the tech titans today combined couldn't loan the government enough money for minutes to keep it solvent. You imagine just the psychology of that kind of wage disparity going on and the debates it had. The word robber barons came about because of people's just fear of them, even though Carnegie Mellon made all the libraries, Rockefeller gave us all the parks, and we can go down the list of their philanthropies. Maybe they did it because they were afraid that the pitchforks were coming. I don't know. You can read about this, but it was just as fraught, just as frightening, in all the same kind of ways we have today. And yes, there are differences, but the differences in character are not, and the differences in impact on people are not. And yet, from that point forward, for the next 80 years, the average lifespan in America went up by 30 years. The average income of an American in real terms went up 700%, just to pick two metrics of what that fluorescence of technology did. And it was a roaring 20s. We had jazz age. We had the Gold Coast wasn't just about money. It was about the dawn of the movie and entertainment industry. It was the dawn of Agatha Christie and The Great Gatsby, and art exploded, and all the kinds of philanthropy that went into the cultures and the arts, and we got healthcare and hospitals proliferated. So last thing I'll leave you with two quotes, which are among my favorite, because I get to refer to economists, because I always beat up an economist, because their models don't predict the past very well, much less the future. We innovate, we create the future. Joel Moyker said in his most recent book, it's a great line, and it's very true. And he wasn't talking about people just being silly, imagining science fiction. He's talking about that the economic growth depends more than most economists like to believe on what people believe. By that, I mean what they believe about the opportunity for growth, for better life, for themselves, for the children. That belief can't be anchored in just Pollyanna silliness. It has to be anchored in fact. That's why I wrote my book, because I think we have a good reason to get the politics right, because the potential is so great. And the last sort of parallel, I don't know, I never met John Barlow. He was a very bright guy, a polymath. He was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, which would tell you, he was also mathematically brilliant, was an engineer. But he had a variant on that, which I kind of liked, again, which is kind of why I wrote my book. The best way to invent the future is to predict it, if you can get enough people to believe your prediction, of course. So, thank you.
Mark, thanks again for an excellent presentation. Very informative. And if you haven't, if you were able to get the book out there, good for you. I would encourage you to read it, because there's a lot more detail in there, a lot of really interesting things. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, just when you were talking about, how things have changed, since you talked about 1920, it's very interesting how you show these predictions from the past. The Ladies' Home Journal predicted that the lifespan and average lifespan in the United States would increase to 50 years old by the year 2000, when it was really in the high 70s. So anyway, so we've had tremendous growth, but there's a lot of super interesting things in the book that I think you'll all enjoy. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, because I want people in the audience to be able to ask questions as well. But one question I'd like to ask you, and this is, I know that a lot of people, when they see, that there's robots that are going to be used in the service industry, or robots are going to be used in homes, they worry about, well, is this going to eliminate jobs? And it's really the oldest worry in the book. And it's something that you highlight that really is a myth. I mean, the idea that robots are going to, get rid of jobs, and we have to worry about that. And I thought a really interesting anecdote in your book is you talk about how President Kennedy in 1961 created a commission to study what are we going to do when all these jobs are eliminated by automation. That was in 1961. And 60% of the jobs, you said that the types of jobs that existed at that time no longer exist, but yet we found a way to replace them with a lot of new jobs that nobody forecasted. So I'm wondering, as a university, you're talking at NDSU, what are the kinds of things that we should be training students to learn, or what kinds of skills are going to be valuable for them if they want to adjust to the changing technology of the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the oldest tropes there is around automation, and it's been around. In fact, as you know, in my book, I found a quote from a Roman centurion who, when an engineer showed them how they could increase through a very clever application of engineering, increase the speed with which they would deliver the blocks to build his chateau, which I'm sure the Romans didn't call a chateau. He said, it would eliminate work. What will I do with all my slaves? I mean, this is a very old trope. It is true that the automation eliminates the job that it automates, self-evidently, which has consequence, because if it happens quickly, you create social disruption. So I don't belittle that part. The Luddites were right? The automated loom eliminated the manual loomers. So they lost their jobs, net more jobs, because there was more wealth in different jobs. But it is the velocity of that's probably picking up now because of AI and automation, I think. So, which is economically better, because the velocity of automation means higher velocity for productivity and wealth. But if you're thinking about what do you do to train for the future, I guess I would read down, and it's a simplistic answer. is even though I studied physics, I'm interested, as you could probably guess, in a lot of things other than physics. And you don't have to get it necessarily in a degree, but you have to orient degrees to push people to be inquisitive and know how to learn. And it doesn't matter what subject you take to learn the skill of learning. When you say it, it's really obvious. So when people tell me math is boring, it's hard. I know, I was a major in math and I dropped it to a minor because it was hard. I really found it was really hard. My friends found it easy. I found it hard. I'm making a minor. But it teaches you, just as an example, it teaches a specific thought process and skill that has applicability in a lot of other areas. It doesn't have to be math. Whatever the specific skill is, could be English literature, becoming a damn good writer, tough skill. So my push is always back to, not that you have to know how to code. Coders are roughly arithmetically as common as farmers, just so you know, farmers and ranchers combined in the country. And in the future, they'll be about the same, co-equal. There'll be fewer farmers in the future and there'll be fewer coders as a percentage of the population, because we're teaching machines how to code so that people like you and I can ask the machine to do the coding. That's the whole goal. I mean, but that would suggest that you want to be creative. So you don't have to be an artist to be creative. You don't have to be a Nobel laureate to know how to learn. I fear a lot of what we've done in education is convince people there's a specific discipline. If you know you want to be an electrical engineer, good, go for it. You want to be an accountant? We need accountants. But for most people, they don't have that degree of hyper-specific appetite. And what I would hope we can do more of is convince them that it's worth doing something difficult that teaches your brain how to wire itself to learn and be adaptive. And it doesn't matter what it is. It makes no difference. As long as it's hard to do. And people naturally want to do things that are easy. I mean, I get it. I'd rather do the easy things. So that sounds like like a squishy answer, because the specific thing isn't you should do math. No. Or you should become an engineer. That's what all Chinese train to be engineers, because they don't get proselytized with communism. And Russians are all good, chemists and physicists, because they don't want to be taught about communism, Marxism when you go to school. So they study engineering, because it's harder to teach you to be a communist when you study physics. They try, but it's harder. So those systems distort that dynamic. They generate more people with degrees in engineering, but they don't become engineers. They become, politicians. They become, business owners, or they have, Starbucks franchise when I was in China, but they have a degree in engineering. Why would they do that? So they could avoid being preached at, right, by the communists. So long answer to, it's nice to make school hard and convince people to pick something to learn. And after that, once you know how to learn, the job will change. You become more adaptive and more flexible, because jobs are going to change. They're going to evaporate. There aren't many tellers left. There aren't obviously draftsmen left. There aren't. Me and go through on a long list of things that don't exist in both engineering and service sector.
Yeah, so I used to teach managerial economics. I should have had you talk to my class about why it was important that it was hard beforehand. But anyway, but let's let some people in the audience ask a question if they'd like.
I haven't read the book yet, but could you comment on one of the inputs, which is energy, not just quantity of energy, but quality of energy? Because computational devices are kind of fussy.
They are fussy. So I've written a lot about energy. For those of you who haven't used Dr. Google to look Mark P. I've written recently much more about energy than robots, because everybody's talking about energy. I'd rather talk about robots. Robots take energy to make, they take energy to operate. So the whole trajectory of civilization has been towards two things. To use a physics term, taking entropy out of energy, making energy more specific and useful. So, heat from burning a bunch of wood has very low utility. If I take that heat and go through a lot of steps and processes, I can turn the heat into a laser beam. The laser beam can actually fix your retina or weld steel or send information to the moon. Very high utility. The difference between the heat from the fire and the laser is entropy. We stripped chaos out of the energy. I have several chapters in my book on one. It's called the energy materials nexus. I write about energy. It's infused in there because people really misunderstand the underlying parts, and they also are now very hung up on something which is frankly kind of silly, which is that we think we're going to abandon energy forms like oil, gas, and coal because the other stuff is new. The sun is not new, just want you to know. Photovoltaic cells aren't new either. We've known about the effect for 150 years. When the first PV cells were invented at Bell Labs in 1954, the first nuclear power plants were built around the same time. And they both have reached roughly the same level of utility in our economy. Nuclear's done a little more. By itself, it's about 12% of the world's electricity. Sun and wind combined globally, they're at 8%, which of all energy, that's 3%. To give you a sense of why that's not a revolution, which is in everybody's heads, is that the world still gets 300% more energy from burning wood, oldest energy form known to man, than it does from wind and solar combined globally. This is after spending, a few trillions of dollars on wind and solar. And if everybody drives a Tesla in the future, I like Teslas, but it's not a revolution. I mean, this is like the analog would be somebody in 1901 says, you know what, I got a revolution here in transportation. He tells Henry Ford, I got a new way to feed a horse. I got a different fuel for a horse. It's better grain, and it comes from a different place. Still a horse. A car is different than a horse. Feeding the car a different fuel is not, it's still a car. So its economic utility function is exactly the same. As long as it operates exactly the same, they don't. I mean, they don't, on average, they don't. They have high utility function, but they're not as broadly useful as gasoline cars. So it's consequential, it's important, it's money, but I'll just do a arithmetical thing. It's in my book as well. I've written about this a lot. There's about 1 billion and change cars in the world. There's about 14, 15 million EVs right now. There were 0 10 years ago, really, except for golf carts. So if the world accelerates and builds 300 million, 500 million, I mean, we get the forecasts that all the people who are excited about it actually happen. I'll tell you in a minute why it won't happen, but if it actually happens, and we get to 500 million electric vehicles from today's 15 million, and we do that in 2 decades, that'll eliminate just shy of 10% of the world's oil consumption. I mean, 10% is a lot if you're an oil trader. I mean, it is. If you're thinking about getting rid of oil, it's kind of meaningless. But we won't even get there because each electric car, this is just an engineering fact, uses about 400% more copper and 300% more aluminum than an internal combustion engine. Never mind lithium and cobalt and all the other stuff. Just the really basic stuff, aluminum and copper. And we know for a fact that the world is not now mining, planning to mine, announced plans to mine, or financing enough mines of copper alone to build all the solar, wind, and battery machines. We're doing enough now because if you do your math, 15 million out of 1 billion isn't a big percentage. So it's not, drawing a lot of the world's copper. You go to 100 million cars and you're drawing on most of the world's copper supply just for cars. Forget about appliances and pipes and homes, and they'll start sucking wind. They're not having any copper for that. So you won't build one of the two because we're not mining enough copper. We can't open mines. Global average is 16 years to open a mine. If you really put pedal to metal, no pun intended, you can open a mine in a decade. But the decade is when we said we're going to have only electric cars. So I could make another forecast. That won't happen. And it's not an aspiration. It's not like I like electric cars, actually. And I think Elon Musk has accomplished something remarkable, something no one else has accomplished in a century. He's built a car company that works. You can't explain the Tesla and subsidies. People always get subsidized. Rich people aren't stupid. You don't buy a $90,000 car for $10,000 off if it's a piece of garbage. It's a nice car. What he did is he stole half the market from the automakers. And by that, I mean, he took 50% of the market for the purchase of cars that cost $85,000 and up. 50% market share globally. This really scared Mercedes and BMW. So they're making some nice cars now too. They're $100,000. Okay, that doesn't change the world. Most cars that people buy cost $22,000 to $24,000, and and you want them to be cheaper, not more expensive. Batteries aren't getting cheaper because the battery, 80% of the cost of the battery is in its basic raw materials. The raw materials costs are going up because we're asking more of the mining industry than the mining industry can deliver in the time frames they can deliver. I'm actually bullish on mining in the long run because they're going to use robots in mines. That's a really good place for robots to go instead of people, because it's really dangerous. And they'll be more efficient. And if you kill a robot, that's okay, because you can pretend it's Terminator and he should have died, but at least it's not a person. And that revolution will happen, but it's going to take a couple decades to get it fired up and have an impact. And then we'll produce lots of copper, but not in these. So I chose to be delicate in the book about energy only because I didn't want to make it an energy book. I may write another energy book. I mean, I write a lot about energy. Energy matters. Robots eat too. I mean, if you think about this, the energy costs to make, in energy terms, not dollar terms, to make all the computers and smartphones in the world, roughly rivals the energy cost to make all the cars in the world, right? I mean, this thing that we all have in our pocket, this weighs roughly 1/10,000th of a car, and it takes to manufacture this about 20% as much energy as to make a car. Pretty interesting. We make a lot more of these than we do cars. Hence, the energy to make all these, because the making these chips it's 1,000 times more energy intensive to make a pound of silicon than a pound of steel. So if you do the math on that, you don't have to make very many tons of silicon to start rivaling the steel industry's energy consumption. So those are sort of features that are wired into the demand side. The supply side, we're going to have more nuclear plants, we'll have more solar arrays, we'll have more batteries, but all of these through all of human history have been additive. They're not replacement. We still burn wood. We still burn coal. We're going to burn all of this stuff for a long time. If we don't like the consequences of burning, and often we don't, we'll invent ways to make the consequences better. We won't stop burning it. We'll just scrub it. We scrub nitrogen oxides. We scrub sulfur oxides. You can scrub carbon dioxide too. It's just too expensive right now. So we'll just have to be patient till some genius with the better catalyst that's been invented by an AI machine with the algorithm that they'll have designed will come up with a catalyst that can do it cheaply. And then if you don't want carbon dioxide, you pay a little extra instead of a lot extra to get rid of it. But that won't happen tomorrow. So if everybody's impatient, they want the revolution for those things to happen tomorrow. They're just not going to happen. So these are easy forecasts. So I didn't make any of those forecasts in the book because they're easy ones. I wanted to make the forecasts that are harder. Not that there are other ones I've just said are controversial. I know that because when I do lectures and talks on that, you're like Exxon, you're in the pocket of the Saudis or whatever the invective is, or you're a climate denier because you don't think the solutions are possible. No, I have nothing to do with climate change. The solutions aren't possible because they're not possible. It's like saying, if I just try harder and spend more money on subsidies, I can teach you how to fly. And if you jump off the cliff and flap your arms harder with a pocket full of money, it's not going to end well because the physics don't work. And this is true for EVs. It's true for solar panels. They have physics limits that cause economic consequences. So I touch on a lot of that in the book, but I try to touch on it in a derivative way, derivative to the revolutions that are economically consequential. What's economically consequential, what's going on in the energy markets now, is destructive in this sense. We're spending more to get the same output, which is the inverse of productivity. And by spending more, I mean in subsidies and in absolute terms. Everywhere in the world, there's more wind and solar. You can look this up. This is not Mark Mill's data. That's EU data because they've done further than we have. Every single country, if you map out the increased penetration of wind and solar in the grids, it 1-to-1 correlates with higher cost electricity. So the claim that this is cheaper isn't true. It's just not showing up. And you have to ask yourself, you want to figure out why it's not true. There's good reasons for why it's not true. They're not political reasons. They're just physics reasons. So if it's not true, quit telling me that and to tell me that if you want to use it, it's going to cost more. And that's not an acceptable political stance to take. Australia did take that stance, by the way, last week. The new government there did tell people, we're going full bore, more wind and solar. And by the way, Australia's electric bills will go up 50% in 2 years. We'll see how that works out. I mean, the people will be voting again in a couple of years. And I think there'll probably be a change and they'll stop doing it. But in the meantime, we'll try and they'll learn the facts. So, but that's it. It feels negative, I mean, and it won't matter in the end. And the reason and I don't mean this to be facetious, markets won't tolerate more expensive energy. They never do over time. And we have the capacity to produce a lot more energy, and we will because we need it to make people more comfortable, live longer, power robots, make the robots. No, it's a long answer to, but it's an important subject. I mean, I didn't have it on my early list of dystopian stuff. I could have done the climate graph, the amount of money we're spending on climate change studies, the amount of money we're spending on alternative energy. That also is trending up. We're sort of at I think globally, we're maybe at $1 trillion a year spending, excess spending on energy to get no more output. You know, it's $1 trillion is consequential. I mean, the world's economy is 100 trillion. So it's only a 1% tax on the world's economy to give this a shot. And I think that we're going to see a political, lashback because the outcomes aren't what people promised. And this is not a lashback of saying climate change isn't a problem. It's not a lashback of that debate. That's a different debate. It's a lashback of the solutions you offered to me aren't doing what you claimed. I mean, the world's increased its coal consumption the last 2 years by an amount greater than the last 20 years combined. Why? Are people stupid? No, they want electricity, they need it cheap. So China, India, all the South Asian countries, and Germany, by the way, its coal burn is up, I think, 40% over the last 18 months. So that began before the invasion. They started burning more coal. And the UK. Because, the data centers need power, 100 times more per square foot. 1 square foot of data center, going to energy factoid, uses more energy than 100 Teslas. And we're building out data centers by the tens of millions of square feet a year. We're not building that many Teslas.
Well, this has been outstanding. We're unfortunately out of time, but we do have a reception. And so please come and ask more questions of Mark. I'm sure you'll be happy to answer them. As you can tell, he's very great at answering them. And thanks again, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it.